So today I'm here to do what I hope will be a fun video, at least it's fun for me, and that is to talk about the things that personally scare me. I recently did a video talking about how to enhance or improve the scariness factor in books, because we all really love a good scary movie, and I know a lot of us, including myself, look for that same experience in books. And for me, one of the main takeaways I had in that video was to identify what type of things scare you and read books based off of your personal fears. And so I thought it was fun to follow that up with more of a personal video talking about my own fears. If you are a longtime watcher of my channel, you probably have guessed some of these before, but hopefully this is interesting. All that being said, let's get started. First, let's talk about gruesome body horror. And again, if you've been watching my channel for a very long time, this is honestly the entry point of what got me into horror. And it was specifically the first kind of horror that on the page actually would scare me, because I really struggle with things that involve horror surrounding the body. So my vague definition of body horror is things typically involving, cutting or injuring different parts of your body in different ways. So manipulation, sewing things, all the terrible things that can happen. And it's something that I really struggle with to watch on the screen. Growing up, if there was any even mild hint of body horror, I would get very sick, as in I would actually throw up. I have passed out during scenes. I remember in high school we had to watch this video talking about smoking, and in the video they showed a lung that had been of a smoker, so it showed the gray lung, and I would just remember I just passed out and fell off my chair. And that's always been the case. It's part of the reason I didn't actually watch horror for a really long time, is that I really struggle, or at least in the past have struggled, with those heavily gruesome scenes. Because again, it's not that I couldn't even handle them, it wasn't that it was necessarily too scary, but I would just throw up or pass out, and so it just was not a good time. I was constantly just getting sick whenever that would happen. For whatever reason, that has eased up as I've gotten older, but some of my first experiences being scared or bothered by a book in terms of horror has come from points of body horror. So I remember reading, say, Hex, where they talk about sewing the lips of the witch. And that just got pulled into my head, and I just could really visualize and picture what that would be like, and it was absolutely horrifying. It's a kind of book or story or premise that makes just my hair stand up on end and just makes me feel very uneasy and kind of gives me that queasy feeling. Thankfully, reading it, I don't actually throw up, but it still gives me that sense of uncomfortableness that lends itself to a really interesting or intense reading experience. Because I always say the worst thing a book can do, especially when it comes to horror, is make me feel nothing. I would much rather feel uncomfortable, feel bothered, feel possibly even ill rather than nothing. And so when it comes to body horror, when it can be well described on the page in a way that I can really visualize and I can perhaps picture it or feel my own arm if someone is getting injured, that works so well for me. And I remember that was the first entry point into horror, thinking, oh, maybe I can actually be scared by books, because that is something that bothers me in all forms, and still to this day is probably one of the easiest ways to scare me. Next up is danger to children. And this is one that honestly did not develop until I became a parent. So if you watch my really old videos before I had a child, I would often brag about the fact that nothing really scared me in books and things like that. However, that did change when I had a child to a degree. Now, I know a lot of parents who simply do not read books involving harm to children or death of children, and I completely respect that. I get why. I do continue to read those books because I choose to. I believe I can separate my fact and fiction, my real life, from what I read. However, those books now bother me a lot more. And again, for me, that's not always a negative. I like books that make me feel something, and I definitely feel that emotional pull as a parent. So if you look at some of my favorite books, like I did a top 15 favorite horror books, looking back at that list, a lot of the books involve parent horror or situations where a child is at harm, and then you're reading the story from the perspective of the parent who's trying to save them, etc. And I can see why those books really appeal to me in a way that they didn't necessarily appeal to me, again, 7-8 years ago. I don't think I necessarily have to explain why it's so scary to have children at harm, because again, it just kind of is built in with that natural instinct once you have that connection to a child that is yours. But it definitely bothers me. I remember reading Pet Sematary when my son was in the hospital in the NICU when he was first born, very tiny, and honestly we did not know if he would survive. And reading a book that also involves the potential danger or harm to children, a child that is in trouble, and then having that be part of my real life experience at the same time was probably a really bad time to be reading that book, but it made for, again, a really strong emotional experience. I have very vivid memories of certain scenes within that book, because every scene felt like a gut punch, and it felt, even though it was a different situation, it felt in my mind to be very reflective of the feelings I was having as a parent in my day-to-day life. So not the most escapist read at the time. Again, I probably should have read it at a different point, but it definitely was a memorable one and one that really scared me. Next is the lack of control. And this is something that kind of ties in with the last one with children, but it's one of these things that when you see it on the page, when it's done properly in terms of a plotting setup, it works really well. So personally for me, in my personal life, in real life, I am most anxious in situations where I do not have control. If something is going on in my life and I can change it, I can proactively do something to make the situation better, I feel much better about what's going on. If there's something that's completely out of my control and I am just feeling like a victim in that situation, that really bothers me, and it definitely kicks up my anxiety. And the same thing happens in books. So when you have characters that are in situations where it is not their fault, they didn't make stupid choices to get there, because that's a whole nother video, but instead they are just forced into a situation that they had no control over, that really bothers me. Again, it's going to depend on the book, the situation, and so forth. But again, if I look at some of the scariest scenes and the scariest books I've talked about in other videos, that's a theme that definitely comes back, is characters that have a lack of control. I think about the kettle scene in The Changeling by Victor LaValle. If you know the scene, you know what I'm talking about. And that is one where there was a moment where the character could do nothing. And I was so terrified for them. I was so worried because I felt like there was nothing they could do in that moment. And that is a horrible feeling to have. Next is maybe an obvious one, but I'm going to say it anyway, and that is real life horror. So what I mean is situations that actually could happen in real life. So pretty much anything that's not supernatural. So again, if you look at some of my previous videos talking about scariest books, things like home invasions. So Richard Lehman's Endless Nights is one that really bothered me because it is basically straight up a real life thriller situation where you have someone breaking into a house and doing horrible things to people. And these bother me in a way that other supernatural books don't, because of the fact that I really feel like they could happen. They do happen. You see it on the news. You hear other people's stories. And so reading those type of stories definitely appeal to a sense of fear in a way that other stories don't, because again, there's always that separation of fiction from reality and thinking, oh, this is just the book, this is just fake. But again, if you're looking at something perhaps like true crime, it's a reminder that not only could this happen, but literally if you're reading a true crime serial killer book, it's a reminder that it did happen, and that is horrifying that someone else had that experience. And I could really do a whole video talking about true crime and the challenge of enjoying a genre that is based off of them being victims and how conflicted I feel about that. So let me know if you're interested in me doing a follow-up video on that. My next big fear is the scarcity of resources, or specifically, let's be honest, I'm mostly talking food. I've talked about it very recently in a video where I do have a history of an eating disorder, and so naturally the lack of accessibility to food really scares me because I never ever want to go back to that dark place again. And so the idea of being without food honestly has a very emotional reaction to me. I feel very primal, even to this day, and again, this is years later where I'm much more healed. I cannot go long without a meal. So other people can just forget or skip breakfast, or maybe you're busy at the computer and you don't eat lunch for 2 hours. I can't do that. I get hangry and I'm not a very nice person. And not only that, but I really do get this sense of anxiety, this feeling in my body that is panicking, going, oh no, we're gonna go back to that place of anorexia. Let's never ever do that again. So for me, reading it on the page really, again, brings out that same feeling. I panic and worry for the characters. I know what that feeling feels like, so it feels very real to me. Books like The Ruins by Scott Smith have elements where the characters are kind of separated from their normal environment. So I love survival horror. Most of them kind of play into it to a degree where they're cut off from those resources. And I had someone comment on a video I did a while back talking about survival horror, and they pointed out the fact that while I was so worried about food, really water is the bigger concern. You can survive longer without food than water. But again, if we're talking fears and not the actual facts of survivability, for me, the lack of food is far scarier than water. I know I will die first with water, but I really want my food. So tell me I'm not alone in this feeling of just being stressed out when characters cannot eat, because I really like to eat now and I don't want to change that. Next is one that is so hard to define on camera, which makes for a great video, but that is psychological elements within a story. So psychological horror is something that I really appreciate when it works, but it's something that is also personal to the individual. And I have done videos talking and recommending psychological horror books, but I've had other people say, oh, that book isn't actually psychological, or why didn't you include that one? And again, it's so specific to the person, what works and what doesn't. So for me, when it does work, psychological psychological elements within a story make a book really scary for me. And how I define psychological horror, which may not be the accurate definition, but books that mess with my head. So I think of something like Uzumaki by Junji Ito, where while reading that book about small towns, I could actually visualize and notice spirals all throughout my life, throughout my home, on my pillows, and suddenly I saw spirals everywhere, and I felt like I was possibly going insane the same way that I was reading about the characters, seeing spirals everywhere and also going crazy. And so I really like books that can make me question my sanity, make me think that I'm tripping out, and specifically books that stay with me when I close the book. So again, I closed the Uzumaki book, I took a break from the book, and the spiral still stayed. And that's always a thing that really scares me, is that piece or hint of perhaps I'm mentally ill, perhaps there's something going on, that history is in my family. And so I'm always on the lookout for something or experience that's going to make me question my own sanity. It's hard to pull off. There's a lot of books I've read that promise to be psychological horror that don't work for me, but when it does, it's terrifying, it's wonderful, and it really messes with me. And now to flip it around, I also want to talk about a few things that don't work for me in books, that don't work in terms of scariness. And so the first one's kind of obvious, but horror comedy. So anytime a book is trying to be funny, it's trying to be a satire, I think that there are some really smart books out there. I enjoy them. But as soon as there's that element of satire in the story, the actual scariness goes right out the window for me. And so I'm thinking of things like Grady Hendrix does some really smart books that kind of make fun and play with the tropes of the horror genre. I think his books are really smart, but other people find them really, really scary and describe them as some of the scariest books they've ever read. I cannot have that experience because there is something about the tone that's just a little bit too light and witty to actually scare me. They just don't quite hit that scariness mark for me. Even if they're trying to be serious, that little tone, that little hint of humor along the way just completely washes it off for me. Another one is horror romance. Now, I think with horror romances, a lot of us are thinking of things like vampire stories and so forth. And definitely I like some supernatural romance, especially when it leans into erotica, dark fantasy, and things like that. But is it scary? No, I would argue it's not really trying to be. It's probably trying to elicit other emotions, which I do enjoy, but they're not scary, and that's a whole nother topic for another video that I probably don't want to film and post on the internet. Another thing that doesn't scare me is horror books that read like action movies, and I'm trying to think of a good example here. Something like The Loop is one that comes to mind, where there's a horror premise to the story, but because of the way the book is written, it's non-stop action, and I feel like it's a story that would work better perhaps as a movie, but it's not the kind of story, whether it be on film or in a book form, that would actually scare me, because when you have a lot of action, for me it cuts down the suspense, and it's again more watching the characters, maybe fight through a bunch of zombies or something like that. And you don't actually have the opportunity to feel deeply for the characters, because often the action scenes supersede the character development. And again, there isn't really that slow pacing or those suspenseful moments that allow me to get really bothered and psychologically enamored and engrossed and so forth. So action movies and action books can be fun, but I find that they're never scary. If there's a lot of action in a horror book, I rarely can have an engrossing, scary experience with it. And I kind of touched on it with the real life horror, but the opposite of that is supernatural horror does not scare me. So ghosts, vampires, werewolves, all of that. I don't believe in any of it, so the idea of it scaring me is really, really hard to accomplish, because as soon as you have a ghost pop up, as soon as there's a vampire or any kind of supernatural element to the story, I just kind of typically roll my eyes and think, yeah, right, that's not real. And so I really struggle, and there's very few books that have those elements that really scare me, and typically it's more of a psychological factor within the book and not the supernatural elements themselves that will scare me in the cases that it does work for me. The last one kind of ties in with that, but you've all heard it, you knew it was coming. Haunted house books do not scare me. I've talked about this before on the Books and Freezer podcast, but I grew up constantly in a home that was under renovations. We were always renovating something. So whenever there is a creaky floorboard or a window that is whistling, all I think is, man, they need to go and fix that house, and how annoying and expensive that is going to be. I don't love renovating, and haunted house stories just remind me how much I don't enjoy that. So that is something that just rarely works for me. So that's it for the video here. I know that this is a little bit different than some of the other things I've done. There's no actual book recommendations in this video. The books that I mentioned as examples are ones I've talked about so many times before that if you follow my channel, you already know that I love these books and would recommend them. But hopefully it was kind of fun to do a bit more of a deep dive into what scares me and why, and also what doesn't scare me. So in the comments down below, I would love to continue the conversation. Let me know what scares you in books, what doesn't, and let's discuss. So if you enjoy this kind of video, if you want to stick around, subscribe. I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy, and other dark things. If you want to drop a comment, even if it's just an emoji like a ghost or something creepy that scares you, I'd love to see that. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.